People, when they get shot, here, now, there, then, they scream. God-awful screams. I can hear them even now. They clutch their wounds and they scream and they cry. They actually cry in combat. At the time, as the whole nation was just horror-struck, because I don't know if you remember that much about history, but the Japanese had ambassadors in Washington assuring the U.S. government that they had no hostile intent in the Pacific.
It was in America's best interest to support Britain. We were allies and had been for a very long time. But Hitler's aggressions towards Europe and towards world dominance made it necessary for America to enter the war. And Hitler also did things like trying to control the Atlantic and shipping in the Atlantic. And American vessels were sunk in the Atlantic as well by German U-boats. So a lot of things going on that eventually pulled America into the war for its own self-interests, but also to help its allies in Europe.
I was born and raised in a little town in Indiana called Kokomo. And my attitude was, hey, look, anything that can take me out of that godforsaken place was a deliverer, a rescuer. They took me out of Kokomo, and for that I'm everlastingly grateful. The former enemy, now treated as heroes. I mean, it was really great.
It would have been a joyous homecoming because it was the quote-unquote good war. This was a war to stop German aggression. It was a war to stop Japanese aggression. And we're talking about an entire world at war with these two powerful factions trying to dominate, one in the Pacific, one in Europe.
I was kind of young. I was, in my late teens and early 20s. And the whole thing was, to me, was like a nightmare. It was pretty much a hell. I really didn't know what we were doing there. I know that I had a duty and that I was drafted to go fight this war.
Now, France was in Vietnam and left Vietnam after some horrible defeats in the mid to late 1950s. So there was some sort of European presence there, and then American presence beginning in the late 1950s with advisors first in the Eisenhower administration and then in the early part of the Kennedy administration. This was a civil war that was going on in Vietnam.
It was just sheer hell for 1 year. A memorable experience that we had, and maybe I can point out a couple of them, but one in particular was we were getting off the heavy Chinooks and we were going to an operation, and as soon as pretty close to landing, we were getting fired upon from this mountainside, and we were getting really fired upon really bad. And one of them hit the wings of one of the Chinooks, and I was in it. And we weren't very high up in the air, so when it was hit, we actually hit down pretty hard, heavy. But they were still shooting us, and when we got out of the Chinook, I could just see the sand, just their bullets just going right through there. And we hadn't even begun to dug in yet. So when we dug into some of our holes that we were just maybe not even 2 feet down, we just dived into them, and we had to call in the Air Force jets to throw in napalm on that side of the mountain to get these guys that were firing at us to stop. And they still didn't stop. We still threw that there, so they were in tunnels in that mountainside. So we finally got all the artillery in there, we finally got all the infantry in there, and took care of these guys so they weren't shooting at us. So those are some of the one of the instances that I can tell you about that was pretty hairy. And so there's a lot of stories like that, but this is just one instance that I can remember right off the top of my head. And we had a lot of people who'd come in there, and we had boys that were shining our shoes and all that kind of stuff. Some of them turned out to be bad, bring in grenades and blow some of the guys up. That actually happened in our base camp. Also, a sniper in our base camp area took out our lieutenant colonel, the first one. The second lieutenant colonel that came in went out to go look at the village from our perimeter, went out the perimeter with our commo person, our captain, and the lieutenant colonel. They hit a roadside bomb. It blew the colonel's head off, and it killed the commo guy, which was a Spec 4, Specialist 4, and he was the driver. And so we had to go out there and get that thing and clean it up, bring it back in after they were blown up. That was 2 colonels. One was a sniper in our area, and the second one right outside our camp.
I don't recall ever even reading about or hearing about dissensions and demonstrations and uprisings. Oh, God, no. If Uncle Sam said, come, we go, we went.
I was so anxious. We got back to San Francisco, and there was thousands, if not hundreds, and not thousands of guys with placards saying "baby killers" to us, and they really did that. This is a true story. We were walking down, they were saying "baby killers." How dare you? How can you do this to babies and women and children and stuff like that? And we looked at them. I was kind of puzzled. I said, "What are these people doing?"
I was distraught at that because I didn't think the Vietnam War was justified, nor the Korean War. I think we bailed out the French in Vietnam because we were now the only power that could pick up the Western concepts, which had to dominate.
Coming home from the war was, I was relieved. I didn't know that I wanted to come home. I knew I was a different person. I was not the same person that got to Vietnam when I got there. I was a whole different person when I got back.
And many people protesting the war, for example, at that time, didn't make a big distinction between the returning veterans and the politicians who led them into war, and that's very unfair. American politicians tried to link Saddam Hussein to the 9/11 bombings, but that was never clearly established. Now, the 9/11 bombings, or the 9/11 attacks, I'm sorry, the terrorist attacks, led directly to America's presence in Afghanistan in order to stop the Taliban. The Taliban supported Osama bin Laden, and so that was fully supported by the American public because of the horror of 9/11.
What I've learned from the Vietnam War, and I like the politics, so I understand a little bit about what happened in the Iraq War. The Iraq War should have never happened. We should have gone after bin Laden, and we went after Saddam Hussein. That was crazy.
Totally unjustified. The worst mistake the country ever made. Horrible. We had no business there, none at all. That was a conjured up war. That's my political bias is showing. I think everybody either knows, or if they don't know, they should be informed, that they have to answer to their own conscience, first and foremost. If you're asked to do anything that is really and truly against your conscience, as an individual human being, you should have, and it should be recognized that you have the right to say, no, I'm not going to do that.